Teal dear, let's talk about microaggressions and the distinct lack of evidence that there is to support them. So today I'm going to take us all on a magical and very lengthy journey through the paper Microaggressions, Strong Claims, Inadequate Evidence by Scott O. Linnefeld. There is going to be a lot of directly reading the study throughout this video, but I will be interspersing it with some of my own thoughts on the issue and bringing up some of the interesting evidence that the author mentions. So I've got a lot to do, let's dive straight on in there, shall we, with the abstract. The microaggression concept has recently galvanized public discussion and spread to numerous college campuses and businesses. The author argues that the Microaggression Research Program, MRP, rests on 5 core premises, namely that microaggressions 1. Are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. 2. Are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. 3. Reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives. 4. Can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports. And 5. Exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. A review of the literature reveals negligible support for all 5 suppositions. More broadly, the MRP has been marked by an absence of connectivity to key domains of psychological science, including psychometrics, social cognition, cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral genetics, and personality, health, and industrial organizational psychology. Although the MRP has been fruitful in drawing the field's attention to subtle forms of prejudice, it is far too underdeveloped on the conceptual and methodological fronts to warrant real-world application. The author concludes with 18 suggestions for advancing the scientific status of the MRP, recommend abandonment of the term microaggression, and call for a moratorium on microaggression training programs and publicly distributed microaggression lists pending research to address the MRP's scientific limitations. So that's given you a brief overview of what it is that we're going to be looking at today, and it should sound a little bit familiar to anyone who has been following the concept of microaggressions over the last few years that it has been in the public discourse. And that's because it brings up in a nice formalized fashion various criticisms that I myself and many others have brought up around the topic over that time, namely the over-reliance on subjective interpretation of events, and as a result a general lack of objective scientific standards for the topic. So with that out of the way, let's continue the reading. Despite impressive societal strides, racial prejudice remains an inescapable and deeply troubling reality of modern life. Although most survey data suggest that levels of overt, old-fashioned prejudice towards minorities in the United States have declined over the past several decades, pockets of such prejudice remain deeply entrenched. As recently as 2008, 4 to 6% of Americans acknowledged in a national poll that they would be unwilling to vote for any African-American candidate as president, and this figure may be an underestimate given the social undesirability attached to admissions of racism. Now I'm going to jump on in here with a thought about a hilarious straw man argument which I constantly hear. When we hear social justice types talk about topics such as systemic or systematic racism, I still find it rather bizarre that to several people those two words seem to be completely interchangeable, but anyway. When that topic comes up and someone like myself comes along and dares to disagree and state, no, racism is not something inherent to the system, as you like to say. It's not even something that's prevalent amongst the system. It's something that is very small. It's something that's confined often to very small groups or to individuals in society. And the often heard rebuttal to that is something along the lines of, oh, so you think racism doesn't exist at all? You think it's impossible for anyone to be racist? Or some other such nonsense like that. When no such statement was made, the statement was that it is a very small number of people, often individuals, but possibly in small pockets. And this opening paragraph here somewhat highlights that. 4 to 6% of people in that survey just said, nope, we're not going to be voting for anyone who's an African American, pretty much regardless. Now, 4 to 6% is a very, very small number, and keep in mind that was a survey done in 2008. So this actually stands more in support of positions forwarded by someone like myself who says, this is not a majority thing. This is not a systemic thing, it's not something that most people do, it is a small minority of people. And while, as this paragraph here does suggest, the number may be higher than 4 to 6%, there's no way of knowing whether it is or not. And this is something which is going to crop up a little bit later. I have no doubt that there are people who do hide genuine racism because it is socially unacceptable to harbour racist views. However, when you start walking down the line of trying to address things which are not overt displays of a certain kind of behaviour, you start going down the roads of witch hunting and thought policing, and that's something which is going to come up a little bit later in this study, but for now we'll move on reading it. Moreover, a growing cadre of scholars contends that in contemporary Western culture, prejudice often manifests in subtler forms than it did decades ago. From this perspective, prejudice has not genuinely declined, it has merely become more indirect and insidious. Such underground incarnations of prejudice have gone by various names, each carrying somewhat different denotations and connotations that need not concern us here, including modern racism, colorblind racism, aversion racism, symbolic racism, and new racism. Research and theorizing on these covert variants of prejudice have spawned interest in the development of implicit prejudice measures, which are ostensibly more sensitive to subtle racial bias compared with traditional explicit measures of prejudice. Nevertheless, the scientific status of implicit prejudice measures, such as the implicit association test, is controversial, with some scholars maintaining that they detect subtle forms of prejudice, but others contending that their validity is dubious. Just for the record, this is something which I have actually covered on this channel before, and I've gone so far as to demonstrate some of the various pitfalls that these sorts of tests actually hold, and have covered some of the interesting little mechanisms which are at work in them, and how in some cases the tests can actually cause the bias that they then report on, and how the idea of just telling someone that they are in part of a group can then result in them displaying a bias that they did not display previously. And that little point there about telling someone that they're in a group and then their behaviour adapting according to that information is something which we'll talk about a little bit later in this paper. The next section, Microaggressions, the Contemporary Context, is a couple of pages long, and I am going to be reading all of it to you, because it's really going to catch you up on what's been happening around microaggressions in recent times, and if it's not something you're familiar with, it should give you a pretty good understanding of what's going on. But I will be interspersing this with some examples of what the author is talking about, just to help break things up a little bit. So let's get to it. Enter microaggressions. Microaggressions are typically defined as subtle snubs, slights, and insults directed toward minorities, as well as to women and other historically stigmatized groups, that implicitly communicate or at least engender hostility. Compared with overtly prejudicial comments and acts, they are commonly understood to reflect less direct, although no less pernicious forms of racial bias. For example, in attempting to compliment an African-American college student, a white professor might exclaim with surprise, "Wow, you are so articulate," presumably communicating implicitly that most African-American undergraduates are not in fact well-spoken. Few would dispute that these remarks, even if not malicious, are almost certainly callous. At the outset, one point should not be in contention. Racial and cultural insensitivities persist in contemporary America, including college campuses. Nor should there be any doubt that prejudice at times manifests itself in subtle and indirect ways that have until recently received short shrift in psychological research. Just jumping in here, I am one of those people who would contend that this statement was something malicious, and I would also contend that it was callous, because as this paper mentions later, we're going to be talking about intent, and then you have to take into consideration the intent of the person making the statement. So would someone saying, "Wow, you're really articulate," necessarily be callous? It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's all very circumstantial. But this is something we'll talk about later, so I'll just keep going with the reading for now. The microaggression concept has acquired considerable traction within this cultural backdrop. The Global Language Monitor deemed microaggression the word of the year in 2015, in recognition of its skyrocketing prevalence in everyday use. In fact, the microaggression concept has begun to alter the landscape of popular culture. For example, a Facebook page, the Microaggressions Project, was launched in 2010 to document instances of microaggressions and to demonstrate, quote, how these comments create and enforce uncomfortable, violent, and unsafe reality onto people's workplaces, homes, schools, childhood, adolescent, adulthood, and public transportation and space environments, end quote. As of November 2016, a Google search for microaggression and its close variants returned approximately 511,000 hits. The concept has also received considerable recent attention in research circles. A Google Scholar search from 2007 to the present reveals 3,090 manuscripts containing the term microaggression, 2,030 of them since 2012 alone. Over the past few years, the microaggression concept has also made its way into public discussions at dozens, if not hundreds, of colleges and universities, with many institutions offering workshops or seminars for faculty members on how to identify and avoid engaging in microaggressions. In other cases, colleges and universities, such as the University of California, Berkeley, have disseminated lists of microaggressions to caution faculty and students against expressing statements that might cause offense to minorities. Just to break in here, you may remember this particular document. Tool, recognizing microaggressions and the messages they send, and this was from Diversity in the Classroom, UCLA Diversity and Faculty Development, and this was published in 2014. And this was a document which attempted to give examples of what a microaggression was, the various themes that they have, and what the actual message is that you're sending. So the first example here, the theme is alien in one's own land, and a microaggression example would be, where are you from or where were you born? And apparently the message that that question is sending is, you are not a true American, and that you are a perpetual foreigner even in your own country. Of course, as we'll see going on with the study that we're looking at, this is somewhat nonsensical. Back to the actual study. On many campuses, calls, and in some cases demands, from college students to formally address faculty member and fellow student microaggressions are mounting. For example, in late 2015 at Emory University, a large student group demanded that administrators add 2 items assessing student-perceived instructor microaggressions to all undergraduate course evaluations. According to the students, quote, these questions on the faculty evaluations would help to ensure that there are repercussions or sanctions for racist actions performed by professors, end quote. As of this writing, Occidental College is considering the implementation of a formal system to allow students to report faculty microaggressions, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison is planning on requiring 1,000 freshmen to undergo, quote, cultural competency training, end quote, which incorporates the identification of microaggressions. Just to give you an idea of what some of this looks like, I've grabbed one of the draft versions of these forms from the Oxy University. The opening paragraph reads, "We recognize and are inspired by the leadership of Oxy United for Black Liberation and their call for widespread institutional change in the culture of the college. We affirm that Black Lives Matter and also affirm the broader ideals of social justice to which their call speaks. We recognize that the structural racism and other forms of oppression of the college violate our commitment to ensuring equity and excellence in our educational programs for all our students. We also acknowledge that our collective inaction as a faculty body makes us complicit in the failures of the college to make our mission a lived reality. For this, we apologize for failing you, our students." Most of the rest of the document is just a non-stop sound of self-flagellation, which sounds a little something like this. Point 1. In recognition of the power imbalance between faculty and students, we will work in consultation with students and the CDO to develop an effective mechanism for students to address and report microaggressions or other conflicts between students and faculty, to begin starting fall 2016. Faculty Council will put an interim policy in place by the start of the spring 2016 semester. So as you can see, colleges and universities are actively working on this. They are enacting policy changes based around the assertion of microaggressions. Back to the actual paper, microaggressions have captured the interest of the business industry too. One estimate has placed the cost of microaggressions to the US workplace productivity at between $450 and $500 billion per year. In response to these figures and to broader concerns regarding the impact of microaggressions on workplace satisfaction, a number of major companies, including Coca-Cola and Facebook, have recently provided training to employees to detect and avoid implicitly prejudicial comments and actions, including microaggressions. Once again, this is just highlighting real-world change being made on something which currently doesn't have very much evidence to support it at all. All of these practical applications of the microaggression concept hinges on one overarching assumption that has gone largely unchallenged. Specifically, they presume that the microaggression research program has been subjected to and withstood rigorous scientific scrutiny. In this review, the author raises a variety of challenges to that presupposition and demonstrates that the scientific status of the MRP is far too preliminary to warrant its dissemination to real-world contexts. At the same time, the author argues that further scientific investigation of microaggressions is warranted, although such study will necessitate a large-scale modification to the MRP. In this review, the author refers to the MRP as the broad line of research focused on microaggressions and their potential impact on the behavior of recipients. And the author then delineates the MRP down to resting on 5 core assumptions. 1. Microaggressions are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. 2. Microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. 3. Microaggressions reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives. 4. Microaggressions can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports. And 5. Microaggressions exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. This author is hardly the first to raise questions regarding the uses and misuses of the microaggression concept. Over the past few years in particular, this concept has been the target of withering attacks from social critics, especially, although not exclusively, on the right side of the political spectrum. These writers have raised legitimate concerns regarding the societal and cultural implications of the microaggression construct, as well as of related concepts such as trigger warnings and safe spaces on college and university campuses. In particular, critics have voiced apprehensions that an undue emphasis on microaggressions a. discourages or suppresses controversial or unpopular opinions, b. fosters a culture of political correctness, c. perpetuates a victim culture among aggrieved individuals, and d. contributes to, rather than ameliorates, racial tensions. Despite its increasing incursion into the popular landscape and its growing influence in scholarly circles, the conceptual and methodological status of the MRP has received scant scientific attention. Only 3 published reviews, 2 of them book chapters, have canvassed the state of the literature on the microaggression concept. All 3 reviews were broadly favourable to the MRP. In a brief review of the literature, Lau and Williams 2010 focused primarily on qualitative research concerning microaggressions and offered useful suggestions for improving the methodology of such research, such as asking majority individuals to generate examples of potential microaggressions and extending the assessment of microaggressions beyond self-report indices. Nadal 2013 offered a brief summary of the history of the microaggression concept and examined the relevance of microaggressions to gay, lesbian, and transgendered individuals. In the most comprehensive review, Wrong, Durthik, David, Shaw, and Okaza 2014 examined 73 scholarly works on microaggressions, including qualitative and quantitative studies. They concluded that the microaggression literature has borne witness to considerable scientific progress, but that further elaboration of the nature and scope of the microaggression concept is required. Wong et al. Argued that microaggression research should move beyond self-report measures and conduct more rigorous examinations of the potential effects of microaggressions on minority mental health. Nevertheless, none of these reviews challenged the central assumption that microaggressions, as currently conceptualized, comprise a psychologically meaningful construct. Nor did they examine in depth the empirical underpinnings of the MRP's forceful claims regarding a causal linkage between microaggressions and minority mental health. In this review, the author draws in part on these previous reviews, especially that of Wong et al., but goes well beyond them in providing a critical analysis of the conceptual coherence of the microaggression concept and the empirical support for its ostensibly psychological implications. In addition, the author offers constructive recommendations for advancing the MRP and caveats regarding its application to real-world contexts, especially microaggression training programs. Okay, so that was a lot to take in, but I really do consider that to have been essential reading because I think it's given us a good foundational understanding of what microaggressions are, where they've come from, and the various problems that they're causing. And it's given us some tangible real-world examples of companies and colleges acting to deal with microaggressions on the idea that they are something that has been legitimately scientifically proven, when there's very little evidence actually supporting the link between the concept of microaggressions and the idea that they actually cause people to then have some sort of adverse reaction to them. So with all of that understanding out of the way, I'm now going to be able to pick out some of the more relevant and choice parts of this paper to read to you, rather than just continuing to barrel on through the whole thing. The next section, which is the goals of this review paper, can be nicely summed up more or less with this single paragraph. The author's review is placing particular emphasis on the extent to which the MRP fulfills several basic scientific criteria, specifically focusing on the logical clarity and coherence of the microaggression construct, reliability of microaggression measures, criterion-related validity of microaggression measures, incremental validity of microaggression measures, and beyond measures of overt prejudice. And then finally looking at the extent to which microaggression findings have been replicated across various information sources, especially among independent observers. And that last point about independent observers is rather important, because a microaggression is something that someone feels like it's happened to them, but an observer may not necessarily see the act of aggression happening, because it might not register to them, because it's not actually an act of aggression. And this is another point which is kind of important and really highlights the subjective nature of microaggressions, and also helps to highlight the general lack of consensus that there is about what exactly a microaggression is. Up next, there is a section about the history of microaggressions, but that's not really very relevant for what we're going to be talking about in this video, but it's an interesting read if you'd want to go and check it out in your own time. So we're going to move on to the section, the conceptualization of microaggressions, and the first point here is very important, and that is that microaggressions are an open concept. Microaggressions, like most and perhaps virtually all psychological constructs, such as intelligence, extroversion, and schizophrenia, is an open concept. Open concepts are characterized by A. intrinsically fuzzy boundaries, B. an indefinitely extendable list of indicators, and C. an unclear inner nature. So it's important to note here, as the author does in this next paragraph, this isn't inherently a bad thing. A lot of scientific knowledge starts as an open idea, a kind of fuzzy, kind of, sort of, could've, would've set of observations that become less and less open as you narrow down what exactly it is that you're looking at. Indeed, even things like the concept of DNA and what exactly is a gene started very, very open, but became more and more closed off as we started to learn more about them. Microaggressions, however, haven't reached that stage yet, and it's still very dubious whether or not its definition is sufficiently clear. For example, it's not evident which kind of actions constitute verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignity, nor what approximate severity of indignity is necessary for an action to constitute a microaggression. A reference to Su et al. In 2007 and also 2010a, microaggressions lie in the eye of the beholder. And this is a very important phrase because this makes it very difficult to work out whether or not you can actually call something aggressive. The example sentence given here is someone stating to a minority group person, "I realize you didn't have the same educational opportunities as most whites, so I can understand why the first year of college has been challenging for you." Now, one potential interpretation of that is that it is a patronizing form of indirect hostility, basically saying, you suck and you're not as good as everyone else. Of course, another person might interpret it as a very helpful and supportive statement to make, saying, look, circumstances were against you, but you can overcome them and let's go do it. So as you can see, the individual reading of a sentence is very, very important. This eye of the beholder and subjective reading on sentences throws up a lot of questions about how exactly objective a microaggression can be, since it seems to largely rely on some sort of group consensus about whether or not a microaggression has happened. But once again, there's no objective standard as to how much of a consensus you need in order to dictate whether or not it has happened. So while you can see microaggressions are an open concept, the problem is they are too open. The boundaries around it is too fuzzy. Having something solid to hang your hat on is always useful. But in social sciences like this, it's not always possible. But you always at least know the kind of general area that you can throw your hat. It's like throwing it into a ring instead of hanging it on a peg. The problem with microaggressions is there is no peg, there is no ring. You're just kind of throwing hats all around the place and hoping that wherever your hat lands, someone else also agrees that it landed there, because then you might be able to make some sort of statement. It's far too wishy-washy in its current incarnation. As this paper even notes, and as some of us have experienced in real life, there are certain topics which are now deemed as offensive and as causing microaggressions, even though they're looking at objectively scientifically sound topics, such as discussing of racial differences around intelligence and mental illness. Even talking about things such as biological sex differences in brains from male to female anatomy and the varying ratios of things like grey and white matter, and how there is a pretty distinct difference between the sexes. Even just having these conversations and doing these studies is rapidly becoming forbidden because of the concept of things like microaggressions. And then, by extension, some people will just outright declare that these topics are racist or sexist, even though it is just observing something which is objectively there. And of course, adding to this is the problem of hindsight. Looking back on things can change the light in which people see things. And there's also the possibility of talking to people and then retroactively changing your opinion on a past event based on what someone tells you in the future. And this paper has a nice little example of this, which I'm going to read to you because it's referenced later as well. Fueling concerns regarding the fluid boundaries of the microaggression concept is the fact that, in hindsight, even statements that might appear to be explicitly anti-prejudiced have been interpreted by some MRP advocates as microaggressions. A telling example comes from Sue 2010b, who analyzed Arizona Senator and then presidential candidate John McCain's response to an elderly woman during a 2008 campaign stop. The woman stated, "I can't trust Obama, he's an Arab," and McCain immediately grabbed the microphone to correct her. "No, ma'am," McCain retorted, "he's a decent family man and citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with." While acknowledging that McCain's defense of Obama was well-intentioned, Sue dubbed it a major microaggression. According to Sue, McCain's assertion that Obama is a decent family man implicitly communicated the message that most Muslim males are not decent family men, as well as the message that were Obama in fact a Muslim, which he is not, it would have implied that he was somehow dangerous, or at least unworthy of admiration. Although these post hoc interpretations of McCain's comments are interesting and might be defensible, they are concerning. In particular, they raise the possibility that a vast number of statements can be labelled retrospectively as microaggressions. For example, had McCain responded, "No ma'am, he's not an Arab, but what would be wrong if he were?" which is the response Sue insisted McCain should have given, some MRP proponents could have contended that McCain was subtly intending to insinuate that Obama might indeed be a Muslim. Furthermore, Sue's interpretation overlooks the more parsimonious possibility that McCain was responding to the effective gist of the woman's comment, namely that Obama is a bad and untrustworthy person, rather than to its literal content. In doing so, he effectively communicated his central point, namely that although he disagreed with Obama on many things, he did not believe that Obama was trying to conceal or lie about his ancestry, or that Obama was a bad person. I really like this example because it highlights how different readings of one sentence can massively change its meaning. and this really highlights how it goes down to individual interpretation. And also, because this is politically slanted, it throws up the possibility of charitable interpretations and how, if you are politically opposed to someone, you might be more inclined to give them the less charitable interpretation. Because of course, once you've decided you don't like someone, it's much easier to justify taking what they've said in the worst possible light, because it fits your worldview of how you think that person must be. On the topic of ambiguity, most proponents of the MRP acknowledge that microaggressions, especially so-called micro-insults and micro-invalidations, are often or usually extremely ambiguous in nature, rendering it difficult to, or even impossible, to ascertain whether they have actually occurred. This paper then gives several examples to illustrate the point, but I'll just give you two here. The person is thrown into a very confusing and ambiguous situation, making it difficult to conclude whether an offense has occurred. Many racial microaggressions are so subtle that neither the target nor perpetrator may entirely understand what is happening. So this is interesting because this is scholars talking about microaggressions, people who are in favor of microaggressions, actually stating they have no idea what they are and no idea when they happen. And yet they do expect people to take this topic seriously. And this sort of admission really should be setting off alarm bells for people in light of what we saw earlier in this paper, where corporations and colleges are enacting changes in their policies based on this non-existent science. Of course, a little bit of ambiguity isn't actually necessarily a bad thing. In some cases, it does allow you to gain a little bit of insight into the person who is telling you about their experience. But, in the case of microaggressions, stimulus ambiguity may, paradoxically, as this paper notes, open the floodgates for respondents' personality traits, such as negative emotionality, to colour their interpretation of items. Surprisingly, this vexing possibility has received little or no attention in the microaggression literature. Given the importance of this issue for evaluating the construct validity of microaggression measures, the author visits this later in the paper, in the section The Largely Neglected Role of Personality Traits. The next section is about embedded political values, and is somewhat self-explanatory, but is also a section which I'm going to keep very, very brief, because the very first citation for this, Duarte et al. 2015, which was a paper which reported on the problems of embedded values in the social sciences and how they were pretty much progressively slanted. And the reason I'm not really going to touch this part of the paper is because the citation here, Duarte et al., is a paper which I've already done a video about, called Teal Deer Progressive Academic Echo Chambers, and that video goes into the problems of embedded political values in the social sciences, and gives examples of times that value judgments have crept into the social sciences and basically become truths, which are only then dispelled when someone of a political bent which is not progressive left-leaning comes in and starts questioning those values. The next section is quite interesting and can really be covered in brief. It's titled, What's in a Name? The very name microaggression implies that the statements or actions that fall under this label are aggressive in nature. Yet confusingly, MRP advocates posit that such behaviors are typically unintentional. This is quite important because the term microaggression is somewhat an oxymoron by definition. As this paper points out, the very term aggression by definition would be any form of behavior directed towards the goal of harming or injuring another living being who is motivated to avoid such treatment. Thus, the idea of accidental aggression makes very little sense. And this paper then goes on to point out that this may actually cause problems, because consistent with findings from other studies, if people perceive an act as being aggressive, they are more likely to respond with aggression, and labeling people who deliver microaggressions as perpetrators may contribute to the same pattern of behavior, and thus using these words around these actions might be encouraging people to feel as if they're being victimized, to feel as if they're being aggressed against when they're not. Then there's the final problem here, and this is micro or macro, and it's another issue of language, and rather interestingly, a problem of mission creep. The prefix micro in microaggression implies that the transgression in microaggressive actions are barely visible or at least challenging to detect. This indeed seems to be the case for many micro-assaults and micro-invalidations, Yet for a number of purported microaggressions, especially microassaults, this assumption is dubious. In particular, many or most microassaults appear to be emblematic of traditional, old-fashioned racism. For example, according to one author team, a microassault may include calling a woman a bitch or a whore. Another group of authors stated regarding referring to an Asian American as a Jap or a chink, explicitly discouraging one's child from dating an Asian American, or publicly displaying blatant caricatures of Asians, such as pictures of individuals with slanted eyes as micro-assaults. So I'm sure you can see the problem here. These actions and attitudes may be very blatant and overt signs of racism and sexism. Circumstance is important, and they might not be. But making the assumption that they absolutely definitely are, there is nothing micro about any of these actions. And thus, this is then scholars using large, very obvious, overt forms of racism and sexism to prop up the concept of microaggressions, which is pretty obviously ridiculous. Another major flaw of the MRP is its focus group methodology. This methodology and its problems should be familiar to people who follow this channel, since it's one which has cropped up before in the CMNI video. Basically, in order to come up with a list of things which were deemed to be microaggressions, researchers get together a group of people to have a chat with about what is considered microaggressions and then get their opinions on them. The problem is, part of the sampling method used for one of these studies selected minority student participants who had to agree that subtle racism and discrimination exist in the United States. So they started from a base point with a group of people who kind of already agreed with the concept to start with. A similar case happened in a different group of researchers when they did a similar thing with a group of African American faculty members in counseling psychology and various counseling programs, all of whom acknowledged that subtle racism continues to exist in the US society and reported personal experiences with subtle forms of racism in America. Moreover, given that leaders of these focus groups were aware that their goal was to elicit examples of microaggressions, group participants may have experienced pronounced demand characteristics to interpret ambiguous racial statements as microaggressive. In some studies, these demand characteristics appear to have even been made explicit. For example, in Constantine et al. 2008, interviewers provided participants with a definition of racial microaggressions and, quote, confirmed that the interviews were intended to focus on subtle experiences of subtle racism, such as racial microaggressions in their faculty positions, end quote. Potentially exacerbating this problem is that in most or all studies, team leaders have been selected on the basis of their acceptance of the core premises of the MRP. For example, Su et al. 2009 acknowledged that, quote, team members believe that subtle racism exists, that it occurs against Asian Americans, that it possesses detrimental psychological consequences, and that it may be ethnic group specific, end quote. So when it came to constructing the MRP, you can see there was very much kind of an already accepted idea that this was a thing. And I think this plays directly into what is covered in my videos talking about progressive academic echo chambers, and how there are certain ideas that are basically just accepted as being the case when there's very little evidence to support them. And then, in this case, these grand conspiracies get woven around these accepted ideas, even though there is very little, or in some cases, no scientific evidence to back them up. They are merely an assertion that everyone agrees with. A further problem that a lot of these microaggression studies and questionnaires fall into is a lack of knowledge of events' base rates. This chapter can be best summarized as when researchers ask questions of people, such as, someone tells you are too loud and should talk less, and you are ignored at a store counter as attention is given to a customer who is of a different ethnic group that is behind you. These things are listed as microaggressions. However, they never ascertain a baseline for the person experiencing these events. So it can never be known if these so-called microaggressions that this person is experiencing are any higher or lower than at any other time in their life, or are any higher or lower than experiences that everyone else is having. It is just assumed that because they are reporting this, that these are unique events happening to them when there is no evidence to support that position. Monosource bias is perhaps the most conspicuous limitation of the virtually exclusive reliance on self-reporting indices in the MRP. This section here is best summed up as follows. There's a very important thing in psychology called critical multiplism. Critical multiplism basically means trying to find the same thing from lots of different methodological vantage points. So if you're trying to find something out, giving a bunch of people questionnaires where they self-report stuff is one vantage point, but then having someone else observe what people are doing and take notes on what's happening would be another vantage point. And then you can take those two sources of data, cross-reference them, and see if there's any correlation between the two. The MRP derives all of its data from one source, which has the potential of biasing the results. Hence it's called monosource bias. As this paper even says, monosource bias renders it difficult or impossible to evaluate the extent to which MRP findings are robust across different informants, including observers. And that ties back very nicely to what was mentioned earlier about witnesses to situations where microaggressions supposedly happened. Because obviously if you took two sources of information, the self-reporting of one person and the observation done by another person, and you put those two bits of information together, you could quite easily find no correlation whatsoever, as the self-reporting person says they experienced a microaggression, but the observer doesn't think a microaggression happened, or it could be the other way around. As this paper does mention, one study did get around that by using observers, but in that study they did not assess participants' mental health outcomes, which invalidates it for then linking microaggressions to mental health problems, which is one of the main points that I'm sure you remember the MRP is attempting to prove, that microaggressions actually cause people to then experience problems. The MRP also suffers from a severe lack of causal linking. Numerous studies have revealed robust correlations between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes, such as psychological distress, anxiety, and depression among minorities. Many MRP advocates have invoked these findings to advance forceful, if not definitive, claims concerning the causal impact of microaggressions on psychological disturbance. Some MRP advocates have even gone so far as to state that cumulative effects of microaggressions shorten life expectancy and foster suicidal thoughts. However, these assertions are totally unqualified. There is an absolute dearth of longitudinal data linking microaggressions to such outcomes. To use the good old meme that is very relevant here, correlation does not equal causation. They have some instances of correlation, but they have absolutely no causal link. And now a big one, which is a good 4 pages of information, but I'm going to try and condense it as best I can. The largely neglected role of personality traits. One personality trait that the MRP has totally ignored is the concept of negative emotionality. People who score high in negative emotionality in testing have a temperamental disposition to experience aversive emotions of many kinds, including anxiety, worry, moodiness, guilt, shame, hostility, irritability, and perceived victimization. And this is very important because some of the studies done around microaggressions have found that in some cases quite large numbers of their test subjects did not experience microaggressions at all. And with no sort of testing or control done accounting for the personality traits of those responding to these questionnaires, they have no way of knowing whether or not these people claiming that they are being microaggressed simply see the world in a generally more negative way than those who don't experience microaggressions, at which point they are not microaggressions at all, but simply indicative of the subject's general personality and view of the world. And this is quite interesting because personality is one of those things in life that's actually partially heritable. It's partly genetic. But as we know, there is a distinct bias in the social sciences against things like genetic behaviors. There tends to be a lot more focus on the idea that everything is socialized. But back onto the point of negative emotions, and how the MRP has made no allowance for them, it's kind of a double whammy problem. First of all, they may be sampling people who are simply more predisposed towards finding everything in the world problematic, but then they ask them to rate how much these supposed negative interactions have affected them, And of course, if they have an overall negative worldview, they're going to over-exaggerate or overstate the negative effect that it's had on them. Now, this is not to say that it hasn't had a negative effect on them, it could quite possibly have done so. But it ends up double reporting someone who is overly sensitive to this sort of thing anyway. To begin winding things down, we're going to have a look at the section Taking Stock of the Scientific Status of the MRP, which I'm just going to read through in its entirety, since it's a rather nice overview of what we've been talking about. As noted earlier, the MRP appears to hinge on 5 key premises, and those are worth revisiting in light of the research that the reviewer has looked at. The first point was microaggressions are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. The support for this assertion is at best murky. The boundaries of the microaggression concept are at present so amorphous that an enormous array of behaviors on the part of majority group individuals, many of them innocuous, can be subsumed under the expansive microaggression umbrella. As a consequence, the false positive rates of current microaggression lists may be substantial and remain unknown. Moreover, some microaggressions identified in the MRP literature are largely contradictory, because there are no inter-arter reliability data on whether recipients of microaggressions agree on which individuals are engaging in subtle prejudice. The extent to which microaggressions reflect consensually agreed on acts of prejudice is also unknown. In some, the presumed microaggressions that are widely accepted in the MRP literature may be an undetermined mix of A. Intentional statements reflecting actual prejudice, B. Well-intentioned but implicitly prejudicial statements, C. Culturally insensitive faux pas that do not reflect implicit prejudice, and D. Entirely innocuous statements that are misinterpreted by recipients. The MRP must make more concerted efforts to pass this potential heterogeneity using multi-method approaches and multivariate analyses. 2. Microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. There is no systematic research support for this hypothesis. Furthermore, it is prima facie implausible that this is the case for all microaggressions, as this assertion flies in the face of large bodies of research in social cognition and cognitive behavioral therapy. It also runs against the grain of contemporary transactional models of coping, which posit that reactions to potential stressors are influenced by individual differences. Specifically, the MRP largely overlooks the possibility, indeed the probability, that individual differences color recipients' interpretations of and reactions to microaggressions. 3. Microaggressions reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives. There is no research support for this assertion. Specifically, there is no evidence that microaggressions are correlated with indicators of either prejudice or aggression in deliverers. 4. Microaggressions can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports. The monosource bias that has characterized the MRP has hampered the field's evaluation of the robustness of the MRP and its generalizability across multiple respondents. The MRP's virtually exclusive reliance on self-reported microaggressions also make it impossible to exclude the possibility that individual differences in the subjective appraisal of microaggressions in part reflect stable individual differences in personality. 5. Microaggressions exert an adverse impact on the mental health of recipients. There is minimal research evidence for this assertion, and the unqualified causal claims of the MRP proponents are insufficiently justified. Furthermore, the MRP's nearly wholesale neglect of personality traits, especially NE, renders it difficult or impossible to rule out the possibility that some of the association between microaggressions and mental health outcomes is attributed to the contaminating influence of personality. The marked ambiguity of microaggressions leaves considerable room for interpretations of and reactions to them to be shaped by recipients' personality traits. These same traits may also boost individuals' risk of adverse mental health outcomes. As it presently stands, the MRP demonstrates only that certain individuals report consistently experiencing a high frequency of prejudicial comments and actions, and that these individuals also consistently report psychological distress. To close us out, the author then gives 18 recommendations for how the microaggression research program could improve its work, so that it could potentially become a tool that's actually useful, rather than merely a bunch of assertions. 1. Provide a clearer operationalization of microaggressions, with a particular focus on which actions and statements do not fall under the microaggression umbrella. 2. Examine the inter alia reliability of judgments of microaggressions, especially the extent to which recipients and independent observers agree on which actions and statement reflect implicitly prejudicial actions on the part of deliverers. 3. Examine the inter alia reliability of implicit messages associated with microaggressions among minority individuals. 4. Avoid the problem of embedded political values. Enlist collaborators who do not necessarily share the core assumptions of the microaggression research program, such as that subtle racism is pervasive in the US society. 5. Examine the statistical relations between deliverer microaggressions and indices of deliverer prejudice and aggression. 6. Abandon the term microaggression and substitute an alternative term that does not imply that deliverer statements and actions are necessarily aggressive and extremely subtle. 7. When developing microaggression measures, adopt a self-correcting, iterative approach to test construction. 8. When generating microaggression items, use focus group members and other individuals drawn from a wide variety of ideological perspectives, including individuals who do not necessarily perceive subtle prejudice as a serious problem in US society. 9. Ensure that microaggression items contain sufficient situational context to minimize ambiguity in their interpretation. 10. Ascertain the approximate base rate of events, example, receiving poor service at restaurants, that are referenced in many microaggression items. 11. Expand the microaggression research program to include alternative sources of assessment in addition to self-report, especially reports from independent observers. 12. Avoid strong assertions regarding the causal relation between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes. 13. Conduct further longitudinal studies concerning the relation between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes. 14. Include measures of negative emotionality, especially those that assess the perception of oneself as a victim and hostile attribution bias in studies of microaggressions. 15. Use microaggression measures that do not confound the frequency of experience of microaggression experiences with the subjective distress associated with these experiences. 16. Report findings examining the correlation between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes after both controlling and not controlling for measures of negative emotionality. 17. Examine the behaviors and personality characteristics of microaggression deliverers as well as microaggression recipients. And finally, 18. Examine the incremental validity of microaggressions above and beyond overtly prejudicial statements and actions for statistically predictive adverse mental outcomes. So, with all of that out of the way, I don't particularly have any strong closing thoughts on this. This paper is very self-explanatory, and has really just formalized a lot of the criticisms that people have been leveling at the concept of microaggressions for years now. And for that, I applaud and thank the author, because the entire concept of microaggressions, much like the implicit association tests, in their current forms are really not worth very much, and are too frequently being used and abused as if they are some sort of scientific authority on anything. They are not. And most worrying of all about these microaggressions is that we are seeing policy changes being enacted by companies and colleges, and in some cases governments, based on what can only really be called pseudoscience.